Well, now we turn to U.S. college campuses, where student activists are facing increased scrutiny as part of a crackdown the Trump administration says is aimed at eliminating anti-Semitism. In one of the most high-profile cases, an immigration judge has now ruled that Columbia graduate Mahmoud Khalil can be deported from the U.S. after the White House alleged his beliefs compromise foreign policy interests. Our next guest helped draft the working definition of anti-Semitism used by multiple governments and universities worldwide. Director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, Kenneth Stern, is now worried that the definition he helped create is being weaponized. He joins Michelle Martin to explain why it's causing harm to everyone, including Jewish students.
Thanks, Biana. Kenneth Stern, thank you so much for speaking with us once again.
Thank you so much for having me again.
So just to remind people, you were the lead drafter of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA. It's the working definition of anti-Semitism. So just to remind people, what was the idea behind drafting this document, and what does this working definition say?
It was actually drafted in 2004. IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, adopted the text in 2016, but it was drafted at a time where there was the Second Intifada and an uptick in attacks on Jews in Europe, and there was a group that was tasked with putting out reports about anti-Semitism. But they said, look, we have a problem. We have all these different data points across Europe, and there's no common sort of score sheet of what people should be looking at. We need a common definition. And then they said that anti-Semitism, in their view, is a series of stereotypes about Jews. But then there was a problem, too. They basically said, look, we have, what do we do if a Jew is attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli? And they said, well, we have if the person is being attacked because the person has these stereotypes about Jews, applies them to Israelis and reapplies them to the person walking on the streets of London or France, that's anti-Semitism, but not if they're upset at Israeli policy. And I thought that was, sort of nuts. And we worked with the director of EUMC. I was the lead drafter, but it was never designed to say that you say something that violates the definition, we're going to classify you as an anti-Semite. And that's the problem of how it's being used as a way to stop speech, as opposed to just take the temperature or give clarity on what's a hate crime and what isn't.
So, in fact, we spoke about a year ago. Your concern then was that mainstream Jewish groups were putting more and more pressure on lawmakers to adopt the IHRA definition as well, and that you were worried that it would be weaponized for the purpose of suppressing free speech. So what do you think now?
Sure. And, it predates the current moment. I started writing about this in 2010, 2011, and I wrote a book about this in 2020. So it's not new. But what I see is using it as a way to suggest what funding goes to programs, what speakers should come to campus. What worries me more about somebody who's spent decades dealing with hate and anti-Semitism is that it's giving an easy solution to a complicated problem. It's saying, take this definition, use it, put something on one side of a ledger or another, and that's how we should think about anti-Semitism. When we're at a moment where I'm really worried about the levels of anti-Semitism, when we're targeting people that are seen as not part of our social contract, whether it's immigrants or Muslims or transgender folks, because if you look at how anti-Semitism works, that is the environment in which it grows, when people fear somebody else among us, and leaders can make that a problem. The other thing that troubles me too, and this is new since the change in administrations, and I see the wholesale attack on higher education and on the legal profession if you have the wrong side and all this. I look back at Jewish history, and it's the times where democracy was under threat, the times of the Palmer raids, the time of the McCarthy era, where Jewish security was the most at risk. And I'm worried that we're entering another one of those periods now.
We can debate about the degree to which some of these demonstrations that took place mainly last spring, how appropriate they were. But some people would just say, look, some of these demonstrations really were anti-Semitic. Things were said that created an environment of fear among Jewish students in particular, Jewish people who happen to be in that environment. And so some people might look at that and say, well, why wouldn't you employ a definition as a kind of a yardstick for behavior that is to be tolerated and behavior that is not.
One of the things is that the fundamental distinction is being lost here, which is that no student should be harassed or intimidated or bullied or threatened, let alone assaulted. But students on a campus, for a campus to work well, students have to expect that they're going to hear things that are going to disturb them to their core. And universities have a responsibility of how do we teach out of this moment? How do we support students and so forth? Not to say there are things that are not going to be heard. I think part of the problem on the campus at the moment also comes from the left with ideas about, oh, you have to be safe intellectually. There are things like, microaggressions. Nobody should go and harm somebody, intentionally and so forth, and be aware of what they're saying. But the idea that somehow we're going to monitor speech means that, there are certain ideas that are okay and certain ideas that are not okay. It's going to prioritize groupthink, and that undercuts, a campus education. One of the other challenges here, too, is that we're forgetting that there are Jewish students on both sides of this. If you look, Jewish Voice for Peace was the group that went to the, Trump Tower. So there's, a debate inside the Jewish community, too, about what it means to be Jewish and whether you're have a particular attitude on Israel. I'm a Zionist. Israel is important to me. But for a lot of Jewish students, young Jewish students, the idea is that their Judaism leads them to an anti-Zionist position. And a case that's really instructive is what happened in Germany when the IRA definition was used to basically classify Jews who were opposing the war in Gaza, calling them anti-Semitic. And one of the things that a person commenting on it said, isn't it ironic that Germany has again decided what it means to be Jewish, what it means to have a Jewish position? And I don't want Congress deciding that here either, and I don't want administrations deciding that. I want them to be able to get students to be engaged about differences about this issue. It's a great topic to talk about how do we deal with differences. If we look at the history of the universities, when we try to say certain speech makes people uncomfortable, and that we're going to outlaw that speech, it's going to backfire and it harms the people that it's trying to protect.
As we are speaking now, the administration has investigated dozens of universities, including Columbia, Penn, and Brown, for the use of DEI initiatives, and also for what they claim is their failure to protect Jewish students, faculty, and staff from anti-Semitism on campus, or their failure to allegedly confront anti-Semitism on campus. And the terms put forth have been very clear: either comply with very specific directions, in some case putting whole departments under receivership, or lose huge amounts of funding. I mean, the administration froze over $1 billion in federal funding to Cornell, nearly $800 million to Northwestern. They threatened Columbia with a loss of $400 million in funding. The irony being that there are a lot of Jewish students and faculty and researchers on many of these campuses. And so when you look at that, like, what do you think it's really about anti-Semitism, or what do you think it's about?
Well, I think it's actually has a much larger agenda that we've seen actually even before October 7th. There's a view of attacking liberal education and seeing it as the enemy. And I think J.D. Vance had talked about things like that about, I think it was after October 7th, but basically saying we should, follow the model of Orban in Hungary, who's closed down universities. So I see it as a broader attack. And one of the things when I testified in front of the Senate, one committee a couple of weeks ago, another one back in September. And back in September, I think most of us, even the Republican witnesses, if my recollection is correct, all agreed that one of the challenges at the moment is that the Office of Civil Rights is underfunded, it's backlogged, there are cases about anti-Semitism, and we all thought that more funding needed to go to that to resolve those cases, because when they're not resolved, it tells people don't care. And there are some cases that are credible and should go through the system. Now they're going clawbacks without the process, without due process. And what I really worry about the larger moment is that we're in an existential crisis for universities. And I get it that universities have tough decisions to make. They have a lot of pressure, including political pressure and financial pressure. This may not be the only thing that's coming down that's going to threaten them. But I think about Benjamin Franklin. If we don't, hang together, we're going to hang separately. Columbia has a 14 to $15 billion endowment. Harvard has a big endowment. I don't always agree with Larry Summers, but he's right when he's saying, what the heck is your endowment for? To fight things like this. So I think there needs to be an organized pushback and to focus on the real threat against higher education, which is going to affect Jewish students too, as you say, and not just say, oh, we're really happy that we're deporting somebody or threatening funding for somebody that says something we don't like.
There have been two very high-profile cases for graduate students in both cases who were arrested summarily. They're surprised. This is Mahmoud Khalil, who's a former Columbia student. He holds a green card. He's a legal permanent resident. He's married to an American citizen who is pregnant. And then in the other case is this Tufts graduate student from Turkey who was on her way to a Ramadan breakfast dinner with friends and was sort of detained on the street. Some people thought it was kidnapping. They didn't know what was going on. And in Khalil's case, he was high profile in the sense that people remember those demonstrations at Columbia last spring, some of which became quite raucous. And he was a person who was sort of a spokesperson trying to articulate what the students' concerns were. In the case of this young woman, Rumeysa Ozturk, the Tufts graduate student, it seems to be that she had co-signed an op-ed criticizing Israel's war in Gaza. And so it seems that, because there hasn't been any other evidence presented, that the reason she was picked up was that this op-ed. And, the argument the administration has made is that, we don't invite you here to tear up our campuses. We invite you here to study. And if you're going to be causing ruckus, then, you need to go. So say more about why you think that's concerning.
Sure. Well, in Khalil's case, he was one of the people that didn't wear a mask. He was obviously very public. They didn't charge him with crime or anything. And one of the concerns me even more is you talk about the Tufts students who signed an op-ed. I just saw a thing from the Student Journalism Association that basically is warning people who are writing in student newspapers to go back and scrub out identities of people that you wrote about, to talk about using anonymous sources. And they're worried about, journalism is supposed to be also produce an archive for people to go back to, but they see that as a danger now. At Columbia, they were at the journalism school. A professor said, and I think perfectly reasonably, and a horrible thing to say, don't write about Gaza, don't write about Ukraine. We can't protect you. And what worries me about all this, too, is one of the things I've done in teaching is that I've mentored students and had programs with students and taught students who are foreign students who come here. And one of the reasons that they come here to study is our tradition for free speech. More than one have told me that, gee, I really want to learn about your free speech tradition so I can go back to my country where we don't have that protection and try to get people to think about the value of an open marketplace of ideas, to debate about ideas and not to have the state suppress it. But we're acting much more like those countries, like Russia and Iran at the moment, than we're acting like the United States of America that I think, we all know and love, and I hope we can get back to.
But, it's interesting. Some of the groups that have been sort of at the tip of this, or at least they claim they are these groups like Canary Mission and Betar, who've been compiling dossiers on students who have participated in demonstrations against Israel's conduct in Gaza, and they have been doing this for some time. Now, the administration claims that they're not acting at the behest of these groups. What they say they are. They say that they are the ones who have been identifying these students and giving their information to the administration. Do you think that their point of view is broadly supported? And if not, why do they continue to act with impunity? Because what they claim that they are acting at the behest of the Jewish community writ large.
Well, Canary Mission has been around for a long time. I wrote about it, in my book, and it first started saying, okay, we're going to identify these folks, and we don't like their positions, and you shouldn't hire them. They're anti-Israel, they're anti-Semitic, they're anti-American. We're going to make it so that everybody knows, and you shouldn't hire them. That was awful enough. But now that they're basically turning people in and taking credit for it. Looking at Jewish history and groups that have decided, oh, there are enemies among us, and we're going to find people and turn them in. To me, that is mind-boggling. You don't like how people speak, you find ways to counter that speech. You come up with better arguments. The reality is that the Canary Mission was, got some significant funding. And then I think the Jewish community 4 or 5 years ago was sort of embarrassed by them. But there was a recent story that they're getting more funding. And that really disturbs me when folks think, oh, we're defending the Jewish people by getting an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old that has the wrong position, that handed out the wrong leaflet that's saying something that I find disgusting. That's going to protect Jewish students. I think it tells Jewish students on campus that adults don't think that they can argue their cases. And I think the better thing to do is to help people that you agree with argue your cases and create environments for having significant discussions and differences of opinion and imagination. I think as we talked about the last time I was on with you, the idea that you should be able to think of people as human beings first, have emotional empathy, have intellectual curiosity, figure out why that person has a deeply different vision than you do about what's happening in Israel, and engage with them and find ways to have that conversation. That's what should be happening on campuses, not to figure out how we're going to deport people that have views we don't like.
Is a concern here that this really has become about speech and not conduct?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's no, listen, if somebody said I assaulted somebody, that's a different thing. If somebody says, you fundraise for Hezbollah or Hamas, even held a bake sale, that would be something else. That would be material support for terrorism. The administration has been very clear that this is about speech. And again, to your point of what I testified about, I'm just, I'm sort of blown away by the idea that somebody saying something that I find totally disagreeable is somehow a threat to our national security and foreign policy. Are we that weak as a country that we can't tolerate kids on campus saying something? I mean, again, it's different than harassing, intimidating, bullying, threatening, all those things. But to say something, which is the premise of apparently of a lot of the actions of the administration and the legislation that's being promoted, that to me is very scary.
So before we let you go, how are you doing? I mean, as a person who's been expressing concerns like this for some time now, how are you?
I'm deeply concerned about what this means for the university with this full-scale assault on higher education, with the clawbacks of money, the threats, the bullying, as you talked about, the receivership. There was just an article about maybe having a consent decree with Columbia to enforce, with the judge enforcing whatever resolution. That becomes you're handing over the university to politicians. And that deeply worries me because, the higher educational system is one of the things that's best about America. We produce students that can think, that have spaces where they could be wrong and learn how to be critical thinkers. And what we're doing is exactly what we've seen on some of the other side, from the progressive side from time to time, is saying, no, there's only one right way of looking at this. But when you have the state doing it and threatening significant financial penalties, that should scare us all.
Professor Kenneth Stern, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you so much for having me.